All right. Hello, everybody. We are in session number 2 of the day, and I have with me Dr. David Bray. He's been serving in a variety of leadership roles in turbulent environments involving people, technology, and data for public good. These roles include bioterrorism preparedness and response from 2000 to 2005, and time on the ground in Afghanistan in 2009. He's also served as the executive director for a bipartisan National Commission on Research and Development, and as a nonpartisan federal agency senior executive in challenging circumstances. David's worked with and advised 6 different startups. He accepted a leadership role in December 2019 to incubate a new global center with the Atlantic Council called the Geotech Center. They're focused on encouraging global tech collaborations. They evaluate good tech choices as well as measure policy alternatives and educate world leaders and the public on issues related to global tech competition. He's been actively engaged in this global crisis right now. But David, we're excited to have you to talk through some of your experience in dealing with pandemics that we've faced before. So thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Do you want to start by telling us some of the stuff that you've been up to recently related to COVID-19?
Sure. So with COVID-19, initially there was questions about, was this going to be like SARS? Was this going to be like other outbreaks that we saw? The short answer is, while SARS and COVID are both coronaviruses, the challenge that we had was with SARS, it was only 3 days between an exposure event and someone presenting signs. Obviously, with COVID-19, we're seeing it's more between 12 and 16 days, which is part of the challenge. And also the symptoms are milder. The good news is, compared to SARS, COVID-19 doesn't seem to have as severe, even though it's obviously still presenting for several people, cases where it's actually getting very severe for them. But the case morbidity and the case mortality rate is lower, which is good to a degree. But I think the real challenge we're facing with COVID-19 is there's just such a long window in which it takes between exposure and actually presenting symptoms. And we're increasingly beginning to see that some of the early evidence shows people are actually infectious before a fever and after a fever. So all those tests that were done early where they were trying to stop people that had fevers, they may have been missing some people that actually were carrying it as well.
Got it. Can you tell us a little bit about what you and your team did at the CDC?
Yes. So in 2000, I joined a small group of about 30 or so people called the Bioterrorism Preparedness Response Program. This was back in November of 2000. Every 6 months, Congress and others said we didn't need to exist. We were seen as a Cold War relic. But the real reason why it existed was because back in 1995, there were the sarin gas attacks that happened in Japan. And then also at the same time, when the U.S. was actually paying former Soviet Union republics to disarm their nuclear warheads, we discovered that they actually were also stockpiling smallpox. And so the concern we had at the time was either a chemical attack or something like smallpox, which is really severe. I mean, it's actually much, much more severe than COVID-19. The case fatality rate's about 30% there, so it's a lot worse. So we were preparing for that. And it was actually scheduled weeks in advance, and that I was supposed to give a briefing on September 11th, 2001 at 9 o'clock in the morning as to what we would do technology-wise should a bad day happen. But of course, 8/34, unfortunately, the world did change with an actual terrorism attack. No believed bioterrorism was linked to it at the time, but we did pile computers in the cars to deal with information sharing, and actually also sent people to both New York and DC to respond to the tragic events of 9/11. Did not sleep for about 3 weeks. October 1st stood down from high alert. October 3rd is when I briefed the CIA and the FBI on what we would do technology-wise should a bioterrorism event happen. It's actually a lot of what we would do with COVID as well, which is it's mobilizing what's called the Laboratory Response Network. The Laboratory Response Network is a group of state public health facilities, federal public health facilities, as well as military labs that have reached a certification level where they can actually do the appropriate test. Unfortunately, it does look like with COVID-19, we're seeing that maybe that investment from back in 2000, 2001 was allowed to atrophy, and we may now need to sort of reinvest and actually rejuvenate our public health, state public health in particular, health system. But also talking about what we do epidemiology-wise. And so gave that briefing October 3rd about what we would do, and then the first case of anthrax showed up 24 hours later, and it was quite a busy time.
Wow. All right. Well, then, can you talk to us a little bit about what you like, how the teams or groups kind of function before outbreaks happen regarding either laboratory or the word is escaping my mouth, epidemiological preparedness?
Sure. So really what you're trying to do is you're trying to put in place ways that you can identify that something odd is happening. And so with epidemiology, it's usually what's called syndromic surveillance. You're looking for symptoms that are different than the norm. For example, we would expect to see a spike in flu-like symptoms during the winter years, but if all of a sudden you're seeing a spike in flu-like symptoms in the summer, that's odd. And so they're sort of looking for symptoms. And so if we were to go to like a VIP event, let's say there was like a NFL game or something like that, what we would be doing is we'd be working with state and local public health officials to try to figure out, maybe 5 days before the event, what the baseline of activity is for school absenteeism. What's the normal rate of people being absent from school? What's the normal rate of, say, 911 calls? What's the normal rate of over-the-counter drug sales? These are all indicators that if all of a sudden you see a spike in, say, over-the-counter drug sales, that could be a sign of something that's going on. Now, we did have events where you actually did occasionally see a spike in over-the-counter drug sales for gastrointestinal-related medications. Happened to be after a Super Bowl event. It was not that we believe a bioterrorism event. It's just the food that you eat after the Super Bowl event does make people rush for either heartburn or other types of medications associated with your GI tract. But that sort of technology, you're really looking for patterns. You're looking for spikes. Now, the epidemiology is what tips you off that something odd is going on. But then the next step is actually the important part, which is the laboratory side. The laboratory side is actually what will either go through what's called a presumptive positive or a confirmed positive of someone being exposed. And so once the symptoms say something, maybe you go see your physician or something like that, they will then refer samples usually to their state public health facility. And the state public health facility, at least when it came for bioterrorism, did have a series of tests that they could run depending on what the agent was. Was it anthrax? Was it brucellosis? Something like that. And it's worth noting that at least for these tests, usually while a PCR was called a polymerase chain reaction, a rapid PCR might help with the initial presumptive, you still had other things that you needed to do to get to confirmation. Technology's obviously advanced a lot since then, but still what we're seeing now is there's probably a need, and it's actually good. I'm seeing more and more state public health facilities saying they will develop their own health test for COVID-19. That way you're not having to rely on, say, the federal government to do it. Challenge is, of course, to make sure that one, it's produced rapidly enough, and then two, that they're all at least as effective as any baseline test, so that you're not getting false negatives or false positives thrown into the mix here. And so I think that's something that's going to help with the rapid testing. I think that's part of what happened with the national emergency being responded, is it actually freed HHS to actually authorize states to actually begin to actually do their own tests as well. But then at the same time, you got to make sure it's all being matched to a reference, because the last thing you want to do is tell someone they don't have COVID when they do, or that they do have COVID when they don't. So you need to make sure you address the false positives and the false negatives.
Got it. One thing that you just made me think of was, well, you've been talking about mostly what's been happening in the United States. What does collaboration look like across governments outside of state to state within a country? Like, what does country to country collaboration look like right now?
Right. And in fact, you hit the nail on the head that that's a real concern, that if we don't actually embrace the fact that we get through this better together, it could actually be a collapse of globalization. It could be a collapse in sort of the idea that people believe in the international order. So at a minimum right now, it is sharing information about what the different epidemiologists in different countries are seeing. Scientists by their nature are usually default information sharers. And so as peer-reviewed articles are coming out about what's being seen, those are being shared internationally. And even the ones that are even before they go through peer review, they're still caveating and saying, look, this is not necessarily peer-reviewed, but it's being shared. But you're absolutely right. I think that the only way we'll get through this is we have to be sharing data. We have to be sharing information. You do technically have the World Health Organization, which is meant to be orchestrating things at the global level, but they are dependent on what nation and national governments choose to do themselves. And so if a nation chooses not to be as cooperative or sharing, that can be a problem. The other thing that's also being shared is just the understanding of where people have come to or are going, because obviously we're all concerned about cross-border flows. But I raise that again, not not to see that we revert back to nationalism, because that would be the worst thing that would actually happen to us, is we would fall backwards, but recognizing that while we have to deal with things on a local level, we will get through this only because we work together as a planet.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I appreciate that perspective. Going back to something you said earlier about responding to SARS and the comparison between these two coronaviruses, can you talk about what we learned from responding to SARS a couple years ago?
Sure. So with SARS, an interesting thing was we actually had suspicions that something was going on through the Centers for Disease Control, that something was going on at least about 5 months before China officially said eventually something was going on. And we knew about it through two ways. One, there are informal networks of epidemiologists around the world. And so you mentioned this sort of question about international collaboration. There were some that were informally saying, look, you're not hearing from me officially, or I can't really say anything officially right now because it's not been approved by my government, but we're seeing atypical febrile illness, which was what SARS was called before it was officially called SARS. It was just not a normal type of fever. But the other way that also was interesting was the sale of garlic. Garlic is seen as a cure-all in certain parts of Asia, including some parts of China. And so when the price of garlic all of a sudden goes up tenfold, that can be seen as a spike, that there's a sudden demand on it that's driving up the price. Now, garlic does not actually treat COVID, so I'm not recommending garlic as any type of therapy because it does nothing. But it's an indicator of people sort of creating a demand that can actually tip off and say something's going on. The challenge, though, was with SARS, the U.S., the Centers for Disease Control, we asked the State Department would ask the Chinese government if anything's going on, and twice each time they said nothing's going on. So it was actually not until eventually, it was in March of 2003, when the Vietnamese government actually asked for assistance from the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control, that we finally actually got to actually mobilize a response to it, because they were the ones that at that point in time said something's going on. And of course, it turned out it actually come from China. It just had now spread to Vietnam at that point. So this does point to the question that really is facing us as a world, which is up until now, up until COVID-19, the good news is, to a degree, open societies have always been better at responding to outbreaks. Now, it may not seem that way right now. It may seem like we're still like trying to figure out which way is up or what's going on, or we don't have enough tests. And yes, there probably have been some fumbles, but that's also partly because we're allowed to discuss about the things that are going on. We're all allowed to discuss about what may or may not be working, and we're allowed to have disagreements. Whereas if you're in an autocratic society, unfortunately, you're not allowed to disagree. And in fact, usually information lockdown is one of the first things that happen. And so right now, up until COVID-19, whether it was SARS, with MERS, or other types of outbreaks as well, you've always been better off in an open society that allows free flows of information, allows people freedom and freedom to make choices, as opposed to a closed society. Now, I worry, though, that maybe now with this one thing with COVID, that we may, in almost letting misinformation in this infodemic become a self-fulfilling prophecy, we may actually paralyze ourselves and eventually demonstrate that autocracies are better for this one outbreak. But this is really going to require, and that's why I think it's so important what Singularity University is doing. We've got to figure out how we work across sectors, how we work across countries, how we mobilize all that we can to show that open societies and free societies can effectively respond to this type of outbreak.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. I'm going to pull up the questions that we're getting from people, because it looks like they're streaming in now. And the top one, I think, is directly, well, somewhat related to what you're just talking about. And the question is comparing and contrasting the different approaches that governments are taking. Specifically, how do we know if the Italian approach, let's call it lockdown, or the British approach, which is skewing us towards herd immunity, is better for containment? And if you could briefly talk about maybe some of the other approaches that people are considering, that would be great too.
Right. So the short answer is we don't know. We know from past models of different types of outbreaks, and this will be where people may look to SARS for an example, or MERS for an example, or even possibly flu, influenza, or anthrax. And I think what initially happened with the United States was we were looking to flu. And the challenge is with flu, it really is where you sort of usually see your physician. And at that point in time, the physician may ask for a test to see if it's really severe. And that's when you would get the test. But now what we're dealing with is a lot of people need to get tested that will probably never see a physician, or they can't wait long enough to see a physician. And so the US, at least, is beginning to adapt and change its strategy, which is good news. With Italy, with lockdown, all models show that if you do that, it does at least contain the spread. The question is how long are we going to have to do that for COVID-19? If it was only a week or two, that might be possible. But now we're beginning to see early indications. And again, this is not confirmed. We don't know enough yet. It's not been fully peer reviewed. But it could be that the infectious window for COVID-19 is between 3 to 5 weeks per person, which means can you actually do a lockdown for 3 to 6 months, which is what might be necessary? I'm not sure. So I think everybody's still trying to sort out what's going on. It's sort of definitely a fog of responding to the outbreak. I do think in terms of what we all should be trying to do, regardless of whatever country you're with or whatever government you're with, is it's really trying to decrease that spike in terms of what begins to happen. Because if we have a sudden spike of cases, then it's going to be a case where it actually creates overcapacity situations for our hospitals and for our medical system. I think we have to be very aware clinician and medical and doctor burnout is very real, and it could happen. And we already know there's cases of where doctors and clinicians have actually gotten COVID-19 themselves. A lot of doctors are possibly in the age group that's more at risk as well. And so that can create some concern as well. And so what we need to do is make sure that we try to lessen that spike, because if that spike is too high, that's going to be a lot more detrimental to any society trying to deal with it than trying to spread it out so that it is manageable and we have the hospital and we have the severe and the ICU units that can actually deal and respond to it. So I think whatever any government is trying to do, right now they're trying to deal with that. The other challenge we have is, again, related to the good news about the internet is anyone can print whatever they want. The bad news about the internet is anyone can print whatever they want. And so there's a lot of misinformation out there. And a lot of what the data is showing right now is people aren't going to governments for information. Now, that may just be a sign of changing times. And it may also put more of a burden and a responsibility on employers if you have a relationship with an employer to provide information, or groups like Singularity and other sort of trusted institutions, because people do need trusted information. I think the thing that we need to be aware of is that while obviously COVID-19 is serious and we need to treat it as so, the fear and the panic around it, if there's anything we learned from bioterrorism, the fear is actually worse. I will say this, is that when the anthrax events of 2001 happened, everybody in the country wanted to get tested for anthrax, even though we thought the focus was only DC, New York, and Florida. And the number one place that actually wanted to get tested per capita was a town. I won't name the town, but it was a town in California. Again, no threat letter or anything like that. May included some VIPs. I'll leave it to your imagination. But we raise that because we have to recognize that the thing that makes bio so challenging for us humans is we can't see it. And so we start to behave irrationally. And so while there are certain prudent actions we should do, and yes, we need to make sure we do the right actions to actually prevent the spread or decrease that curve, we also need to recognize at the end of the day, we do need to keep a level head about us, and wherever possible, think about others and think about what we can do to assist.
Yeah, thanks for that answer. Let's see, Lorenzo has got a question for us, and they would like to know, will new viruses become a constant in the coming years? And I imagine they're talking about at the level of COVID-19.
Right. So there are some that have theories that possibly as we increase the number of people on the planet, right now we're 7.6 billion people, that there's just a risk that this will happen. There's also some that say with climate change, with warmer temperatures, there's a risk that this will happen. And I think while both are possible, I think we should not discount the fact that clearly COVID-19 has been a wake-up call for people. And I think if you had tried to make a pitch to help work to develop technologies and approaches that could create an immune system for the planet, if you tried to make that pitch as a startup back in 2018 or 2019, you probably would not have gotten an investment for it, because they would say low probability event. That's never going to happen. And so while clearly nobody wants COVID-19 to happen, and we don't know what the future has in store, it's going to galvanize world attention from governments, from the private sector, to make sure future things like this don't happen again. And it's also going to mobilize entrepreneurs and tech individuals to try and figure out what they can do to protect their families, to protect their communities. So if anything, I would expect once we get through this initial gauntlet of the uncertainty about how bad is it going to be and what other steps do we need to do, I think it will mobilize people's attentions. Just for reference, I did make a pitch back around 2008 and then actually again in 2015 to DARPA, saying we do have the technologies nowadays through rapid PCR, through sort of testing on a chip, through sensors. We could actually work across nations to develop an immune system for the planet that was always analyzing what was in the air, what was in the water, what was in the soil. And if it identified something novel, it would actually start to sequence it and then try to figure out the 3D folding. I mean, you already see with COVID-19, they are dedicating high-speed computers to trying to figure out both the folding surface of the actual virus, but then also identify things that could actually serve as antigens to actually block what it does to the body. And I raise that because this might actually be something that once we get through this, we will actually be able to assemble different people from across sectors and across institutions and nations to develop a actually worldwide immune system. So I actually have hope that this will galvanize people's attention to this important issue in ways that were not possible 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I definitely skew on the hope and optimism side of us as a society and species being able to come together and solve for as many things as we possibly can. And it's, on the one hand, it's unfortunate that it takes an event like this to bring us together. But in times maybe like these, historically, we have seen massive innovation. Are there any specific innovations that you've already come across or collaborations that you find particularly interesting right now?
Yes, so I've actually been talking to some companies. So we know that supply chains are being disrupted, and it's going to be particularly challenging for medical and clinicians that are trying to make sure their machines are operating and working during this time. So for me, this is actually an opportunity for additive manufacturing and 3D printing to rise to the occasion. We actually already saw a case in Italy where parts for a certain machine had broken. And they were actually able to take a computer scan and actually scan a 3D image of what the parts were, and then actually print them using a 3D manufacturer to replace the broken part. And so, while obviously the first rule of any emergency public health response is don't get in the way of the responders. Let them do their job. They have trained, they've actually learned and rehearsed. So trying to introduce something new in the midst of a response can be very detrimental to the response. But at the same time, not getting in the way of the responders, let them do their job. If equipment starts to break down, or if they actually have problems getting supplies where they need to get to, I'm actually interested as to what 3D printing and additive manufacturing might be able to do to replace broken parts to make sure those machines keep on running in the midst of this time of disruption.
Yeah, that is interesting because it's, right now I think that the obvious ones are like, oh yeah, we'll go 3D print the valve that you need to run the respirator, but it's right. Not. I was talking to an entrepreneur yesterday about the PCR test and all of that technology. You don't really think about those things that are going to go down when it and then become the bottleneck in the production of the things we actually need. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, and if anything, again, it's going to be also thinking about for communities, what can they do for themselves? Here's the thing that actually, again, that may be a good news story in all of this, is that oftentimes I ask people, how many people know more people online than they do in their local neighborhood? And the result, usually more than half the audience usually raises their hands that they do know more people online. And I'm probably sort of, again, I'm trying to do this outside to actually emphasize that people should at least enjoy their immediate surroundings. But I raise that because what we may all need to do is actually double down on what can we do for our local communities, what can we do for our networks, and at the same time, share those community practices across the world. And we can do that through the internet. And so if something's working well for one community, share it with other communities as well, that they can do it too. So this may actually be an interesting time to harmonize working locally, working with your neighborhood, and at the same time, thinking globally as well.
Awesome. Well, I think that takes us to all the time that we have with you today. We have 38 more questions, though, so we got to find a way to follow up with you and maybe get some answers to these later on. So we will be in touch with that. But thank you so much for joining us today. Do you have anything that you want to leave the audience with?
Again, it's all on us. We can either choose to have this be a moment in which we fall into loneliness and despair, or we get so depressed about what happens. I hope we don't pick that path. But we can also pick the other path, which is a path in which we say, this is something we will get through. We've gone through hard times before. Imagine 1940s in Europe. We will press through this, and it really is upon all of us to think about what we can do as positive change agents in the midst of all this to support the response, to support those that are doing things to get information out there, helpful information, and think about our communities too.
Fantastic. Thanks for being here, David. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks for the role that you're playing so far and hopefully keeping us healthy from here on out.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your time. Take care.
All right. See ya. All right. Sorry we had to cut that one short. We should be back on track for everything else today, though. We'll do our best to keep answering these questions. The sessions moving forwards all have a healthy amount of time for Q&A. So apologies that we haven't been able to get to many of them. just yet, but we will get better at that as we go. Also want to take a moment to answer a couple questions that I see coming up kind of time and time again in each session. So first, yes, all these sessions will be recorded as soon as I end this broadcast. If you go up into the top left of your screen and click on schedule, you actually can see all the sessions there. And then from there, you can go back and watch any of the replays almost immediately after the sessions. When we do take questions from the audience, I've started to tag them, so it makes it easy for you to go through and watch the answers if those are the questions that you have. Also, if you're having any trouble with bandwidth, it feels like it's cutting in and out, or the audio isn't clear, the video is not great, the best way is to go up into the top right and click on help. And then there's going to be some helpful tips that can turn down the video so it's not broadcasting in high def, which is the normal setting. So that usually clears up most things. If that's not it, try a refresh and come back in, and that should help out. It looks like things have really smoothed out since this morning, so we're going to do our best to keep on moving. So I think with that, I'm going to end this session. We've got Dr. Daniel Kraft up next, who is really going to be going into the innovation that's happening right now and just how people are coming together across the world to build innovative solutions in response to this global pandemic. So I will see you with Dr. Daniel Kraft here in a few minutes. Thanks and welcome to the 400 new people that have joined us just in the last session alone. So we're excited to have you. If you're new to Singularity University, please go and check us out, su.org, to learn a little bit more. Give me about 5 to 10 minutes to get into the next session, and we'll automatically pull everybody over so you don't have to go anywhere. Thanks.